So I told my husband that we needed to turn the clock off because it's here in the parlor with me. And he said, you turn that clock off when I die, and no sooner.
So it's a good sign it's still ticking then.
Time because
yeah, so it's only on the hour, I promise. There's no like every 15 minutes we'll have to stop and listen to that silly thing.
Okay, we'll get started in just a minute. I see the attendees are joining, so I just want to give them a second to get into our session before I start talking. Okay. All right. Well, let's get started then. So, everyone, thank you for coming. Welcome to the Newburyport Literary Festival. My name is Jennifer Entwistle, and I am the co-director of the festival. And we are so pleased to be able to bring you these added events for a mini history festival today that we call Heroes and High Flyers, focusing on books honoring the men and women who serve our country. But before we get started, I just want to mention a few housekeeping items. We're using Zoom webinar, which means that you can see the panelists, but we can't see or hear the audience. So we have the chat enabled where you can make comments, but we do ask that you ask any questions for the authors using the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. So we'll have time for Q&A towards the end of this session. We also encourage you to purchase your books through independent booksellers because they need our support now more than ever. So once we get started, I'm going to put links to our partner bookstores into the chat session. So I'm now going to introduce our authors. So Jessica Pearce Rotondi is the author of What We Inherit, A Secret War and a Family's Search for Answers, which Salman Rushdie calls exceptional. Originally from West Newbury, Massachusetts, she now calls Brooklyn home. Previously, she was a senior editor at HuffPost and a staff member at PEN American Center, the world's oldest literary human rights organization. Jessica is a graduate of Brown University, and What We Inherit is her first book. We also have Bethany Groff Dorau, and she's the author of A Newburyport Marine in World War I, The Life and Legacy of Eben Bradbury, A Brief History of Old Newbury, and a primary contributor to the Defining Documents in American History series. She's the North Shore Regional Site Administrator for Historic New England, based at the Spencer Pierce Little Farm in Newbury. Bethany holds an MA in History from the University of Massachusetts and lives in West Newbury with her family. So welcome, Bethany and Jessica. And Jessica, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you, Jen. It's great to be back at the Newburyport Literary Festival, and especially to be here with Bethany today. I don't want to make anyone jealous, but Bethany and I had an amazing call on Friday about our books, just geeking out about history and about our research process. So I'm so excited to share a little bit what we talked about with all of you today. And we thought we'd open up by just talking briefly about our books. So I'm going to give you a quick overview of What We Inherit. This is a book I've been working on for over 10 years, and it's a deeply personal story about my family and about history. So the book opens with the loss of my mother, who died when I was 23. But in the wake of her death, I uncovered declassified CIA documents and letters and maps in my childhood home that all pointed to a family secret. And that was my Uncle Jack, who disappeared when his plane was shot down over Laos on March 29, 1972, and just never came home. And the crash echoed one my family had already gone through in World War II, when my grandfather parachuted out of a burning plane, was captured by the Nazis, and spent 3 years in Stalag 17. So because he survived his shoot down and his ordeal, he always believed that his son survived too. And he spent the rest of his life as a veteran trying to bring his own son home. And 40 years after my grandfather went to Laos in search of his son, I recreated his trip. And the closer I got to the last known place Jack was seen alive, the closer I got to my family that I missed, but also the mysteries of a war that left Laos the most heavily bombed country in the entire world. So it's memoir, it's travelogue, and it's a deeply reported investigative history. Which brings me to Bethany. I'd love for you to talk about A Newburyport Marine in World War I.
My pleasure, and my pleasure to be sitting here with you, Jessica. I'm on the steering committee for the Literary Festival, so I'd been sort of following Jessica's book from a distance. and was actually, I'm at a disadvantage. I'm at an advantage because I've seen you speak about your book already as part of the literary festival, and the similarities, aside from just being, West Newbury girls, were striking to me, and I am so happy to be here with you. So thank you so much for joining me. So Eben Bradbury was a total accident. I had no idea that he existed, and I had no plan to write about him. It's World War I is not my area of professional expertise. It happened in one of those bizarre serendipitous moments. I was actually assigned a chapter for the Defining Documents series that was mentioned in my bio about the Battle of Belleau Wood, which is a horrible, murderous slaughter, as so many World War I battles were. It was the largest day of casualties for the United States Marine Corps up to that point in history. And it was I was using original documents. It was a real slow slog. And I left the house to take a break. I went to drive to CVS. I stopped. I looked over at a rock, which is this great lesson to all of us, to look around you as you go. And I read a plaque on the rock that said, dedicated to the memory of Eben Bradbury, killed in the Battle of Belleau Wood. And I had that moment that so many of us have in our lives, especially when we live in a place that we know pretty well, where we think, okay, well, that's weird. And I might want to figure out why that happened to me. So I asked some questions about Eben from the local community. I did a little bit of cursory research. And, I hate to be this shallow, but the big turn for me was when I went to look at his picture in the Newburyport City Hall. And his picture, which you can see on the cover of the book, this is my Eben here. He's also on my shelf. But that's the picture that's on the wall at Newburyport City Hall. And it really spoke to me. I have sons that are around the age he was when he left to go to war. And I sort of stopped and just stared at it and really felt like I needed to know more. So in the course of my research, I came across a Korean War veteran named Steve Bradbury, who had been sort of preserving his memory in a wonderful way. And Steve gave me an amazing gift, which was a mission to bring a medal that had been cast for Eben Bradbury to his grave in France. He was not returned from the battlefield where he died. About 60% of casualties in that battle did come home, but he was one of the 40% that did not. So I went to France for the first time in 2015, brought him his medal, thought I was done, did my mission, sort of did my thing. That was the reason that the serendipitous thing had happened. And then crazy things started happening as soon as I came back. I wrote an article about the visit for the Daily News. Don't ever undersell the power of your local paper. And things started arriving at my house from all over the world that had something to do with Eben, letters and documents going back to the early 18th century. And so, just when I thought I was done my mission, it just started. And that has been happening over and over again with this. The day I said to my mother the book was written, I took a second trip to France, which we can talk about in a little bit, the sort of pilgrimage. I really connected with your trip to Laos with a friend. I mean, there's so many incredible similarities between our journeys. And of course, my journey is not about somebody that anybody that I know personally knew. So it's been about sort of reaching back and, looking at his family and getting to know them through what they left behind. And there is that for you as well, Jessica, this, sort of trying to know a person that you've never actually met through what they left to the people that love them. And so it's been a real adventure. I can't say it's over, but this book deserves an update, I think.
Definitely. And I love what you said about the term pilgrimage to France. That resonated so deeply with me. Having followed in my grandfather's footsteps to Laos for a man that I never met, just like you never met Eben. What drew you to France in the first place? What made you think I need to bring this medal to a grave that Eben's own parents never visited? I think a big part of your book was just how his parents never made it to France or reclaimed the body. What about the timing now made you feel like this is the moment I need to go? I have to travel to France to close this story.
Well, it's an interesting question. I don't think I would have gone to France to visit Eben, even after I sort of met him and I knew him. I didn't feel this compulsion. The reason that I went to France is that Steve Bradbury, again, who's a veteran himself, had joined the Bradbury Doyle VFW post. And when it closed, he took this medal that had been cast for all servicemen in Newburyport, but this one had been designated for Eben, and it had been made, but never picked up.
Yeah.
So it sort of passed down this long, windy road and ended up at the VFW, named after him. And Steve Bradbury, who shares his last name, although he's like a fifth cousin, took the medal and made a promise to himself and to his, fellow veterans that he was going to take Eben this medal. So fast forward, Steve has a wonderful, rich life. He is involved in the fire department. He's a historian of the local fire companies. He's a great guy. He was actually a neighbor of mine in Newburyport when we first made our contact. And he sort of, in that initial phone conversation, he expressed to me that he felt like he had not kept his promise. And to me, I think for you as well, there's something about this idea that I've promised to do a thing.
Mm-hmm.
And I felt that from him. And I also felt it was coinciding at that same point with the passing of the generation of my great uncles, all of whom served in World War II. And I felt pretty profoundly that I had failed them in failing to sort of honor what they had done. I found out a lot about what they'd done after they died. And so all this sort of came together, and he heard it on the phone, and he said, "You will take it to him." Because he said, I'm too old, I can't make the journey the way that I wanted to. So at that point, I had no idea. I didn't have any of the letters or the documents from the family. This all happened after that first journey. I was going for Steve, and I was going a little bit for my great uncle George, who had the back of his head blown off in Okinawa, and I never asked him what that was all about. And for my Uncle Ray, and from both my grandfathers who served in World War I. So that for me was this sort of like, okay, I have a mission. And I think there's a little other thing there that I've been thinking about recently, which is that I think a lot of women, I have a full-time job and lots of kids. Sometimes it's great to have an external person say, you have to do this thing. And then you're like, I have no choice. I have to prioritize this. Steve asked me to. So I did go over, and I brought him his medal, and it was incredible. And then the second promise I made, after all the letters began arriving, there was a year after that first visit, a box of letters arrived from a man in California who had found me on the internet. And then another man, totally separate man in California, arrived with 40 pounds of documents in a suitcase, flew up on the red eye to give them to me. And I said to both of those men, I'm going to write a book, and I'm going to sit with him at his grave on the 100th year commemoration of his death. And I made that my mission. So I went back in 2018 with my dear friend Cynthia, who, again, friends on journeys is a whole other topic, but it was just a great privilege. And again, both of those times I promised I would do a thing. The second time I really went for Eben, and even more than going for Eben, I went for Eben's mother and father, who grieved so horribly and silently after he died. So it was quite an adventure. And of course, your journey as well, your journey to Laos was also in the footsteps of your father. You talk about that journey in your book.
Yeah, I think with Laos especially, it's called the secret war in this country. Even though it wasn't such a secret, there were thousands of lives impacted by it. In Laos, it's really in people's front yards. So I think part of the reason for going was to kind of complete this trip my grandfather, had made. So he went in 1973. It was still a fairly active war zone. He was within 80 miles of the crash site and was turned away by police. No further, it's not safe. He went to refugee camps where he met with people that were in the town my uncle was bombing, but could not get any further. And so there's this heartbreaking family photo album, it says on the front in like 70s gold lettering, but there's no family in this photo album. There are just these photos after photo of blank sky and mountains and trees taken from the airport, which is as close as he could get to his son. So he's photographing the mountains where he believes his son is, but could not actually fly towards them or run or whatever he was compelled to do. And so that really galvanized me to push it a little further and go there. So I got into an unmarked white van with a guide and interpreter and kind of traveled where my grandfather was always intending to go. And that felt like both closure for my family and also as an investigative reporter and a journalist to really see the craters made by those bombs, to meet the people and the descendants of the people that were under fire that night, and to kind of understand what it looked like looking up from the sky on that piece of earth. And that was a lot of closure. There is no grave there, clearly, but there was just a sense of longing for a piece of earth that I got to go to, and I feel very lucky that I got to be there.
Yeah, that's incredibly powerful to stand at the place the second time I went to France, Cynthia and I pored over battlefield records and talked to all the experts, locally who have parents and grandparents who remember details of that battle. And we were able to find the place where the machine gun nest was located. So we know Eben died short of the field, just short of the woods. So we were able to look out from the woods into the wheat field and know that somewhere in this, 50-yard area is where he was shot. So and that was just a very powerful moment. Just to be physically present. We are animals, aren't we? We all sort of return to this, familiar. Being in the place is incredibly important. Even, of course, now virtually, none of us can be anywhere, but it's really incredibly interesting. One of the other things that was really compelling about your book to me, Jessica, and one of the things I think that it has in common with mine is that we both started with an individual person who was sort of an ordinary person. I don't think either your uncle or Eben, who knows, had they lived, but neither one of them, was an officer or a celebrity of any kind. And so we had this very emotional sort of research to do and excavating to do, but we also, as a journalist, as a historian, we have a responsibility to the truth and we have responsibility to the record. So how do you balance this sort of emotional journey where, you're getting messages and serendipitous things are happening and there's fireflies and you're being sent on missions with, honest, good, old fashioned and very big picture research? You had to tell the story of a whole secret war to have your readers understand what your Uncle Jack went through. I had to tell the story of the Marine Corps and, the American involvement in World War I. What was your research process like? How did you balance those competing sort of micro and macro needs of your book?
Great question. So I spent 10 years researching and writing this book, in large part because so much of what happened in Laos is still classified, although in the past decade, a lot has come to fruition. And I've also was able to have 2 CIA officers on the record for this book, which was a long practice in kind of earning trust and trust building. But I think unlike World War I also had the benefit of living history, right? I was able to speak with people who knew my uncle, who knew my grandparents. There was one of these moments where I was looking at all these classified documents, and then I'll try Google and see if I can kind of find something to back up this assertion here. And I found an article in a magazine from the 2000s saying, I was supposed to be on a plane, an AC-130 that went down. I'm so lucky, but also guilty that Jack Pierce took my place. And so I was like, wait a minute. Jack wasn't even supposed to be on that plane. All the research I had done pointed to, these tightly knit crews that were trained together, that always went together. So like, there has to be a story behind why he was last minute switched out. I found a letter to my grandparents saying that I was the last person to see Jack alive. I saw him in the canteen that night before he flew. So like, I tracked him down and got the true story. And it was, not just a history of, okay, this is when this battle happened and this is what happened the night he was shot down, but the politics of the local base. What happens over beers when all these men who are risking their lives every night are on high alert and high edge, and kind of holding that in one hand, and then stories from his high school girlfriend or his friends who knew him as a 17-year-old, and how much that 3-year period of his life, from leaving his small town that he never really left before to going to Southeast Asia, and how his personality and friendships and life changed. So I think it was not only a responsibility to tell these wider points of history, which I did feel very strongly tied to do, especially given the silence in our schools around Vietnam and Laos, but also the story of an individual man. I think, like you said, it's not an officer, it's not a celebrity, but for me, that was almost more important, to talk about someone that could be any one of us. I exist because my grandfather parachuted out of that plane and wasn't murdered, but like was allowed to live and came home. I wonder who would have made it if Jack had come home, and what kind of family, what kind of accomplishments would be here. And you never know is the answer. And you had some incredible moments in your personal history too. There was this letter, it was like basically a gone fishing note scrawled from Eben's father to his wife, Lizzie. And it was just this beautiful kind of intimate moment in their marriage that you captured alongside larger moments of the war. Can you talk to me about how you chose what to include from the family versus what to include about Eben specifically?
Sure. So again, about a year after I went to France the first time, this bundle of letters arrived, and it was tied up with string. It had never actually been opened. This man had purchased it along with, at a sort of an auction, and realized what he had, and had just Googled the name on the top of the envelopes and sent them to me. So they were passed directly in a way from Eben's family to me. And it's funny, it's not funny at all, it's tragic, but one of the letters that was in that bundle was what the Marines call the last live report, which is what you were just talking about, where the person that saw your loved one last writes and says, you know, here's where they were and here's what they were doing. And we have ours, it's from a Sergeant Carl McCune, who was standing next to Eben before they ran out into the field. And you know, says all the things you want to hear about your son. He was the bravest boy I ever knew. And, you know, that is an incredible that must have been a talismanic thing for his family to have, to know that this person's but again, the physicality of this person's handwriting and knowing that he's a real person, was incredibly important. The note you're talking about struck me so powerfully because it was accidental. I was looking through all these letters and I'm filing them, and, you know, they're in envelopes. So opening these envelopes, which is a huge act of sort of violence against the historical record in a way, because I'm making the decision that I'm going to open these letters that haven't been opened in many years. And this was written on the back of an envelope. So it was a letter, it was a business letter about something not terribly relevant. And I turned the envelope over and it was a note from Eben to his wife, basically saying, I'll be back later. I'm going out with the boys. And it was such a moment of intimacy in a marriage to me. And of course I knew Eben's father left. He was the collector of the papers and the letters. And so I knew so much about his life. He kept a diary pretty much every day, although the year Eben died is missing. We have the year before and several years after. So I had this really intimate sort of knowledge of him. I know his shoe size and, you know, how many peanuts he bought at a time and what his whist scores were. I know all sorts of things about Eben's father. And here he was writing a little note to his wife saying, you know, I mean, what a perfect little glimpse of a marriage. And of course I know about his wife from what he wrote about her. He, you know, adored her. So that was definitely, I had a couple of like, oh, I can't even stand it moments, knowing what happened to them and knowing the, you know, sort of incredible intense sorrow that followed the death of their only son.
Of course. And silence is something I wanted to talk to you about as well. You mentioned there's a gap in the historical record. There's no diary from the year he was lost. You also have this moment in your book where Eben's sister, Marguerite, she's graduating from college. She gets a note from her brother after his death. She doesn't know he's gone, but it's 2 months later, right? And she thinks, you know, we think about these historical moments in families, like graduations, wedding ceremonies. She was also married right after her brother was gone. But you also write in her letters home, even after they know that Eben is gone, she doesn't mention her brother, which resonated with me so much because my mother never talked about her brother either. Like my mother was married a month after her brother was declared dead. I was married a year ago, actually in Gloucester, in May. And like, I know what it feels like to get married and have the person that you want there the most to just not be. Can you maybe speak to how sometimes silences in records can even say more than words could? I'm thinking especially of how his parents were notified that Eben was gone.
Oh. So that's another heartbreaker. And in these bundles of letters that arrived were letters that had been written by Eben's father that had then been sent to France and had wandered around all over France. They were stamped, you know, sometimes 8 or 10 times because the letters were trying to find Eben where he was. And then they were marked killed in action. They had an official deceased killed in action stamp over them, and then they were sent back home. And so they were still sealed when they arrived back to me. So Eben's father, these letters, again, went from Newburyport to France, you know, went all over France, were sent back home from France by a woman from Newburyport who happened to find them in the dead letter office. I mean, again, the coincidences are amazing. Went back to Newburyport, were taken by the family to California, came back from California to Newburyport, and I delivered them to France to Eben and read them at Eben's grave to sort of try to come full circle on something, try to close some sort of loop, which, as you know, Jessica, you never really do. You can try, but there are things that make you feel like you've completed a circle, but a loss like that never heals, really. And the most astonishing thing to me in the written record is that Eben's father, who adored him, they walked together for miles and miles and miles and talked about baseball. They just loved each other. Stopped talking about him, was so angry. You know, we talked about the physical letters. The parents were repeatedly sent letters saying, do you want your son's body sent back from France? And they never answered. And then finally they got a nastygram saying, if you don't tell us, you know, we've asked you 3 times, you just need to tell us or we're going to come to your house. And Eben Sr. filled out the form and they said, disposition of the body. Do you want the remains returned? He wrote no in capital letters, period, and stabbed the period through the paper. And that, after all that anger, and that was a thing that our families had in common, or the families we were reading about had in common. After all that, Eben's father and mother both just stopped talking about him, and his father never mentioned his name again. And that was the hardest thing for me to understand. You love someone so much and you miss them so much, you're grieving so deeply. How do you just not ever talk about them? And of course, you know, it's a trauma. It's a kind of it's a reaction to trauma. His mother was actually on the Gold Star list, which would have paid for her to visit his grave in France. And they found her in California. They ran it in the local paper and they ran it over and over again. They sent letters to her house and she never responded, which tells me that she also had shut down and become silent about him. And that silence drove me through this process in a lot of ways. You know, I showed up at Eben's grave and I was the first person to ever visit him specifically. There's a visitor register. And I visited him on behalf of them and thought, you know, they may have regretted at the end of their lives not making that journey or not talking about him. You know, neither one of them even said they ever had a son in their obituary. It was an astonishing level of silence and I think it was trauma and rage. One of the things I wanted to talk to you about was this. Your family had a very similar experience, but of course, since it's your own family, you also, you know, really understand the dynamics there. You know, both Eben's family and Jack's family felt profoundly betrayed by their government, and that their loved one had been, and the death of their loved one had been terribly mishandled. Can you talk a little bit about the impact that had in your family?
Yeah, so, you know, I grew up with the stories of my grandfather's heroism. His medals were on the wall. He marched in every Memorial Day parade. You know, I have a 7th grade tape with me where I recorded his story. I was like, Grandpa, what'd you do in the war? It was just such a part of, he was so open about his own service with me. But, you know, when I was doing my research in the 70s and 80s and 90s, there are hundreds of newspaper articles where he said, you know, not knowing where my son is the greatest betrayal I can possibly imagine. Betrayed was just a word that appeared over and over in these letters. And there was this one scene in the book, which I think is the most powerful because it literally is kind of verbatim from this trial transcript where the Air Force was trying to declare Jack dead with the passage of time, presumptive finding of death. There's no body to bury, but we need to kind of close this up. It was 1979, a month before my mother's wedding. And Ed just stood up there and he is trying to recount who he is. It's the introduction section, right? So he's saying, my name is Ed Pierce. I was shot down on October 14th, 1973, and I was a prisoner of war until 1975. And they have to be like, actually, honey, your son was in the 70s. You were shot down in 43. Like, he was so angry. And it was just so clear that his own experience, how can you not lay in bed at night and think about your experiences becoming your son's? And the crazy thing about this too, I have what are called his mental hygiene clinic notes, which are basically therapy from the VA. You know, if maybe you can scrub your brain a little harder, you'd be clean, right? And his therapist or his analyst, whatever you want to call him, had this killer line that I used as a chapter title. He called him, this man does not need psychological attention. He's just politically depressed.
Aren't we all?
Right? I know, come on now. You know, but every single session, instead of talking about himself, he would just talk about his son and this deep, deep anger that he felt. And like you, there are documents, declassified CIA reports where the pencil has ripped through the paper. It is underlined, like the possibility of a survival still exists. Lies, 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 like these exclamation points, these just moments of anger that are literally transcribed onto the page. And it was, years later, I was still, you know, I had this anger that they didn't talk to me about this, but then I had this secondary anger about the betrayal they went through after giving so much. All 4 of my uncles were in the Marine. One was a Marine, one was in the Air Force, one was in the Army, and they were all brought home after Jack disappeared. My grandmother said, you're never getting one of my boys back in again.
Wow. Yeah. How do you read the fact that they didn't talk to you about this? Do you think that they were, you know, you didn't know Jack, and so they just thought, okay, well, the last person that knows him is going to be the last person that has to experience this grief? How do you understand that in your own life?
Yeah, so in my family's hometown of Milford, Pennsylvania, where my mom grew up, there are actually monuments to Jack throughout town and like the local playground. So my cousins grew up knowing about him. There was like assemblies in class where they talk about Memorial Day and our missing son, Jack, who went to that high school. My mother was the only child to leave town, much like Eben's family, who made it across to California. Mom got married, moved to Massachusetts, to Newburyport initially, then West Newbury. And, I think a lot of it was escaping grief. I think she had spent so much time dwelling and being identified as Ed's daughter and then Jack's sister that it was almost like with her own children, she wanted to protect us. And there's even a line from my grandfather in one of the newspapers in, I think, 91. He says, I want to do something about my son so my grandchildren never have to go through anything like this. And I do understand, like when I go home to West Newbury, people say, I loved your mom, or I think about your mom. It makes me feel so connected to her. But I walk around New York and no one knows my past or my family or what I've lost. And it's almost, I think, a chance at a do-over. But in doing that and trying to completely escape that sight of loss or that sight of grief, I think we're losing sight of a chance to kind of grieve and heal as well. And especially with unresolved grief, 36 years of not knowing if Jack was alive or dead. Much like Eben's family spent an entire summer thinking he was alive and then learning he wasn't and not having a place to pray or honor him. I think that does generations worth of damage.
Yeah, and this sort of, we talked a little bit about this magical thinking that happens, I think, when, especially when there's a loved one and you just don't know what's happening with them. And Eben's family certainly went through that, getting letters after he was already dead. That must have felt like it's not possible that he's dead. I just got a letter, and in fact, nobody knew he was dead. The Newburyport had a big commemoration of the first battlefield casualty in July, and he'd been already dead for a month. So, everything that happened sort of becomes infused with meaning for these families. It's really incredibly powerful. And I know we've got some folks that probably have some questions for us, but I wanted to, one of the beautiful things about this journey for me has been that I have been able to become closer to living people through this process. First and foremost, Steve Bradbury, who I hope is watching. And if he is, I love you, Steve. Steve Bradbury and his whole family have become family to me. And of course, we are distant cousins because I'm an inbred townie, just like anybody else that's been here for more than 100 years. But you, Jessica, and the friend that I traveled with, Cynthia, who's been a friend for a long time, but I would not have necessarily ever known that I was going to go on a journey like this. Cynthia is an incredible photographer who documented our trip. One of the other things that happened, my book also sort of dives into the history of the Bradbury family in Newburyport. And his great-grandfather was a silversmith, a fairly well-known silversmith. And as I was reading your book, we talk about talismanic objects, and your grandfather kept the spoon that he had used in Stalag 17. Is that right? He kept it with him for the rest of his life. Eben's great-grandfather was the son in Bradbury and Sons, silversmiths at the beginning of the 19th century. And the family in these letters are the patents for the spoons, the receipts for spoons they sold, and then sort of the family tussle over who's going to get the silver because they had all this silver to disperse. And one of the things that came back to me from California was a spoon.
Wow.
A Bradbury spoon. I don't know if you can see the little mark on the back. I don't know if you can see it, but there's a B in the middle and it's got the, the Indian on one side and the eagle on the other. That's the Bradbury mark. And what's happened since then, it's a cereal spoon. What's happened since then is that not only do I have a spoon from the original Eben Bradbury collection, which is then documented all the way back to its manufacture, but people have started sending me spoons, Bradbury and Sons spoons, and I've started finding them everywhere. I went to a completely random auction and there were Bradbury spoons there, and I won them, I bought them. Sometimes they pop up on eBay, but they've started arriving in the mail, which has been, again, a great blessing of my life, people that connect to that. And I had the great honor recently of giving one of the original spoons to a young Marine who had he had read my book randomly, and he had contacted me to tell me that he wanted me to bring Eben his medal, his rifleman medal, next time I go. So the next time I go to France, I'm bringing him a marksman medal from a Marine who wanted to pass that on to him because, of course, he failed his marksman training. It's a long story, but the Marines were like, if you're breathing, you're on the ship. That was how that went down. But how has this connected you to the living people that are involved in this story?
Yeah. So
Aside from just me, you know, because we're besties now.
no, I almost started crying when you mentioned the spoons. You know, that was what my grandfather used to lecture us with, was like, this is my World War II, you know, I was a prisoner, and it was just, so eat your cereal. Oh, okay, Grandpa. You know, these are things that people touch, put in their mouths, such an intimate part of daily family life. So how powerful that they all found their way back to you with the letters. Wow. Yeah, I mean, for me, there were 13 other men the night that Jack was shot down that are missing. And some of the sons and daughters who don't really remember their parents because they were so young, and I have connected. So actually, I'm not going to tell you exactly when, but one of the family members reached out, and for Father's Day, I'm going to be reading and talking about the incident with family members. There is a letter from a little girl whose father was lost that's in the book. And, you know, I think in a lot of these families, we found similar patterns where they were the center of the household, the firstborn son, the namesake, the one we're all so proud of, and he just didn't come home. And then there's either silence, or some family members create these like treasure troves, like my grandparents, where my mom's childhood bedroom was turned into basically a war room where all the documents were stored, kind of the command center in the search. And the Simmons family in the book also had a similar experience. And then just the power of the military to, you know, 40, 50, 60 years after a lot of these incidents, the men who threw the AC-130s, who were in Ubon, Thailand, as part of the 16th Special Operations Squadron, they're still like brothers. I mean, one of them never went home. He's like, I feel closer to my fallen brothers here in Thailand than I do in my own native soil of California. And he goes every year and drops a wreath in the river in memory of the 14 men that were on the plane that night. And it's not something he writes about on social media. It's not something that he kind of performs publicly, but it's his private grief that he has, and he's kept going all these years. So I think when living Marines contact you about, I want to do this, I think it doesn't matter if it was 100 years old or in living memory. I think there is such a pull and identification with those who have served.
Absolutely. I had a struggle when I was first starting to tell this story, because I'm not family. I am family distantly. I'm a fifth cousin of Eben's mother. But I felt complicated about, you know, requesting his records and visiting his grave and taking on the responsibilities that a family member would traditionally have performed. And one of the things that has made this really beautiful for me is that living Marines have told me that it's important to them, not only that someone is remembering a fallen Marine, but that someone is remembering a fallen Marine who's not their relative. So they're, you know, it has this power that they're, and you know, I guess that would be my message to anyone. There are so many incredibly interesting, powerful stories, and you know, it doesn't necessarily have to be your Uncle Jack, although that's an incredibly powerful connection. You know, there are so many people that deserve to be remembered, and so many stories that deserve to be told.
And Bethany, there was a question for you from Diane Newark. I'm curious how Bethany's family reacted to her journey and her commitment to Eben.
Oh, well, my kids roll their eyes because we have to say good morning to Eben's Rock every time we drive by. We'd be driving to school and I'd be like, hi, Eben. They'd be like, oh, it's a rock. He's not even there. So I mean, I think, you know, they've sort of come to live with him. But my daughter jokes about all my dead friends. I've got this sort of, you know, group of people that I've researched that I've come to feel sort of close to, that are part of our lives. My husband has been incredibly wonderful and supportive. Whenever we go, he went with me on the first visit to France. He'll be going with me. I'm going to be going for the rest of my life. And he understands. He understands the powerful connection. He has a son. We have two sons together, son and a stepson, that are around that age. You know, I think he's very understanding, and everywhere we go, I buy him beer, so he's happy. So everyone's been wonderful. My father and mother have enjoyed being part of the process as well.
So I can help you with the Q&A so that you don't have to look at these, but we do have a couple of other questions. So Bethany, when did Eben's parents leave Newburyport? Was it their attempt to escape the pain and loss of their son?
That is an excellent question. I believe it was, although they didn't leave until 1921. They left shortly after the dedication of the rock. That was the rock I ran into. Eben's father writes in his diary about trying to avoid all the townspeople that are trying to make a hero of his son because he's so angry. Of course, he didn't write anything about him after 1919, but right after his death, he was very angry. So California had an interesting connection to the family because Marguerite, Eben's older sister, had married a man from California had moved to California. So they were then going to be near their only surviving child. Marguerite's a whole other funny connection between Jessica and I, because of course Jessica's mother was the sister, and her in that situation. I became very fond of Marguerite, who was the sort of bossy older sister who always wanted to be the only child and then was and didn't like it at all, you know, really. But that's how they ended up in California. And you know, they were in Newburyport, Newbury, Salisbury since the 1630s. You know, Eben's earliest ancestors in this country included Mary Perkins Bradbury, who was convicted of witchcraft. I mean, they couldn't be more sort of inbred townie, but they really had an incredibly strong connection. And I think that they left because they couldn't be present for it. So yeah, I do think they escaped because of their grief. And luckily, everybody in California has been sending all their stuff back. So keep going. I love it.
Jessica, you've got a question from Alex Baker. He asks, I know Laos still has tons of unexploded ordnance from the war, and the legacy of the way is still ongoing. Does your book try to make that point as it tells your uncle's story?
Very much so. So it's the most heavily bombed country in the entire world. More people were bombed in Laos than the amount of bombs dropped in Germany and Japan combined during World War II, and 50 people a year still die from bombs left by Americans over half a century ago. So there are 2 chapters in the book where I actually go to this place called the Cope Center, where there are just hundreds of limbs dangling from the ceiling, prosthetic limbs that are made for like both children and adults, because it's such a problem there. There's dedicated hospitals for those who are maimed so severely they can't walk. They lose their hands. And there's this moment in the book where I put my arms through this little glass box, and you wiggle one arm and then you try to wiggle the other, and through mirrors it looks like your hand isn't moving anymore. And it teaches you very bodily and physically about what it feels like to have part of your body taken away from you. I talk to villagers living over the shadow of these bombs, and you know, I come from a proud military family, but I think a lot of even the veterans who served in that war acknowledge that there were deeply, deeply problematic things that happened to the people on the ground. And that's one of the reasons I went to Laos. I didn't want it to be this story based on paper and one side of the conflict. I mean, the book itself is divided in 2. There's hope and despair. There is the military and the people on the ground. And I really wanted to capture the push and pull of that, because it's something I felt deeply as a white woman walking into this village that was still recovering. Great question.
So Beth Welch asks, what are your current projects? So are you working on something new for both of you? So Jessica, do you want to take that first?
Oh gosh, so yeah, I think I've been working on fiction for my next project. I love this so deeply, but it was 10 years of kind of heavy things. And yeah, I'll just say that for now. I'll let Bethany go.
Well, it's funny, you know, Alex Baker just asked that last question, talk about synchronicity. Alex Baker's grandmother was the one that found Eben's letters in the Paris Marine Post Office.
Wow.
So hi, Alex.
Wow.
It's wonderful. It's a wonderful little bit of serendipity. Hi, Beth. I'm not sure whether Eben is done with me yet. And I will tell you that the last time I marched into my mother's house and I said, you know, I need another project. I think I'm done with this. And that same day, I got an email from a woman in Oregon who said, you're an answer to my prayers. I have all these documents. I mean, every time I'm done, you know, they keep dragging me back in, but it really has been happening so much that I'm getting a little bit zen about it and just waiting to see what is going to happen next. I don't understand why these things keep coming back unless there's something else that's waiting to happen. And in the meantime, you know, I'll keep writing my histories and talking about Puritan New England and raising baby turkeys and having a great time. But I don't think Eben's quite done with me yet.
I'm sorry we don't have the baby turkeys on your screen, Bethany.
Sorry, I've let you down. The next Zoom will be with baby turkeys.
Well, I think I don't see any other questions. So, and I think we're just about out of time. So, Bethany and Jessica, I really want to thank you for joining us this morning. This has been a fantastic session. These are 2 really powerful stories, and you know, it's hard. I guess it's awkward to say I enjoyed it because it was so heartfelt and tragic in a lot of ways. But this was a fantastic session. So, thank you both for joining us, and to everyone who's attending, thank you for joining us. We do have a few more sessions today. So if you're interested in hearing more stories, please go to our website and register. It's, as you know, it's quick and easy. So I hope we'll see you in some other sessions. And thank you both so much, and everyone have a great day.
Thank you. And thank you to the Newburyport Literary Festival as well for continuing to host these wonderful events. So thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you, Jessica.
Thank you. Thank you, Bethany.